Everyone, and welcome to our first class. This is just a little bit of an introduction to get us started, and we're going to tackle the topic of defining art, which is actually itself not a small topic, but we are going to deal with it fairly briefly in today's class. So, as I said, we're not really going to explore this in enormous depth today. We're really just going to try to get some ideas on the table, and we will come back to this issue in our live class session on Tuesday. So one thing that I think is important to acknowledge is that we all come to this topic with some preconceptions about what we think art is, or examples of what we think art isn't. And that is completely fine. Inevitably, we're all going to have those. What we're going to try to do today is sort of open up some territory for discussing different ideas about what art might or might not be. So I would say for today, the main thing that's just important is to keep an open mind about different ideas of art. And we're going to be discussing this more this week, but just to really understand, there are many different ways of defining art, and there hasn't been, as far as I know, one definition that has ever satisfied everybody all the time. What it turns out is that there are many different definitions, and that they kind of work well for some kinds of art, but often ignore or discount other kinds. So we'll, as I said, be talking about this more as we go on. And just sort of a brief preview of coming attractions, I'd like you to go ahead and read the assigned chapter from Charles Harrison's Introduction to Art. You can read the pages 9 to 30 as well if you would like to, if that would help you. But I've kind of put us right down in the middle of the chapter in the part that he's talking about two different theories of art. So this is definitely the part I would like you to focus on for our discussion. Okay, so here's the big question. What is art anyway? And ultimately, does it really matter how we define it? I am not going to answer that question, either of these questions really right now, but I think they're both important. Okay, so one thing that makes defining art kind of tricky is that it's actually not a kind of thing with specific physical properties that we could identify, some kind of essence, so we could submit it to a series of, let's say, physical or chemical tests and get back an answer that would say, yes, this is definitively art, or no, it definitively isn't. Art is just not that sort of a thing. So I thought we could actually take a moment and talk about the example of glass. So certain kinds of compounds that that you can make, particularly ones that contain some level of silicas, are able to be in a material state that is called an amorphous solid. So when you look at a compound in this state, it looks perfectly solid, right? And if you, for example, take a drinking glass out of your cabinet or a glass dish or bowl and look at it, it looks perfectly solid. So it seems solid, but actually, if you examine the molecular structure of a glass, it has the properties of a liquid. So this little diagram down here on the screen shows you a typical solid, right? Will arrange itself into a sort of crystalline lattice. It's nice and strong and durable, and it gives that solid its properties. So glass looks from the outside like it would have a molecular arrangement, somewhat like this, but actually the molecular structure of glass looks more like this image on the right-hand side. It is amorphous and indeterminate. It has not coalesced into that nice lattice structure, and that gives glass its specific properties. So if you think about some of the properties of glass, for example, It's very hard, but it's also quite fragile, right? It's easy to smash. And that lack of durability is related to the fact that it has this sort of molecular structure. Of course, the other thing, that's sort of a downside in a way of glass. An upside is that it is solid at room temperature, but at higher temperatures it is quite malleable. It can be blown, it can be molded, it can be shaped and formed in various ways. And there's actually a long history of humans making use of these unique properties of this amorphous solid to make useful things. So glass is kind of a strange hybrid, and we can understand it on the molecular level by understanding this particular structure that we're seeing here. Okay, so glass would be an example of something that we really can identify specific physical properties that it has, and characteristics that it has that are more like a liquid, characteristics that it has that are more like a solid. Okay, now let's say we didn't know any of that though. Let's imagine that we have no idea how glass is made, what it's made from, in other words, what its sort of chemical properties are, what its physical properties are. Let's say we were completely ignorant of any of that. Well, we could actually still learn quite a bit about glass. So on the screen now you can see some of the different ways in which we would be able to consider glass. So we could look, for example, at glass as an economic product over time. What areas have specialized in production of this product? How much of their economy is attributable to production and trade in this type of product. We could think about glass culturally. What kinds of meanings have been associated with it? What kinds of ideas or poetry or art has been associated with glass and its metaphors? And you can probably think of some examples, right? We could consider it historically. How has it changed over time? What kind of role has it had in human history, right? So there are many different ways that we could actually have quite an informed discussion about glass without knowing its physical properties. And the reason why I bring this up is because I think that this is obviously really true of art. We are not going to be able to define a physical structure of art or locate chemical properties or in fact any essences really that make something art or non-art. But the fact is we are going to be able to think about it, study it, talk about different meanings over time in different places, talk about how it has contributed to the economy, talk about its role in various kinds of histories. So we're going to be able to do that even without knowing its physical structure. Okay, so just briefly, to go back to the glass example for a moment, I just wanted to mention the product obsidian. So obsidian is actually a naturally occurring glass, and there are a couple of other kinds of glass that occur naturally, and you can see they're in somewhat unusual instances where you would have something that has a lot of silica content, like a lava flow, or even the foam from lava. Or let's say an expanse of sand like in the desert or on a beach, and you have high energy inputs that are naturally occurring, such as a volcanic eruption or a lightning strike into those silicas. That will give you natural forms of glass, and obsidian's a really interesting one. The others are somewhat less common, I would say. Pumice you may have held in your hand. Fulgurites are pretty uncommon. But obsidian was actually something that occurred quite a bit. And this particular map, it's a little bit hard to read, but this is the Mediterranean Sea, and you're looking sort of at Cyprus right here, this island, and this is Turkey, and the sort of northernmost region of the Arabian Peninsula. And what you're looking at here, the triangles, this blue triangle is a site where there was a lot of naturally occurring obsidian. This red triangle is another site. And because these other places didn't have that, these triangle sites were able to become very wealthy centers of power that could trade this for other things that they wanted. And you're actually seeing in these dotted lines, just sort of a generalized route to a smaller dot, right? And you can see these dots spread around here. These are all sites where this obsidian from this center was found, right? So we can actually document trade routes from, these are about 10,000 years old, maybe a little bit older. And you can see that there are very sort of well worked out trading routes, including over sea and overland routes that we can map by the presence of obsidian. So this is an example, right, of without knowing the chemical structure, we actually can get a lot of information just by seeing how it becomes spatially distributed and inferring the sort of economics of how that might have happened. If you think about humans learning how to manufacture glass, how to make their own glass, that seems to have occurred at the earliest point in this very same region, not too surprisingly. So here in Syria was the earliest site of glass manufacture that we know of, but it was actually the Egyptians who quickly actually recruited a lot of Syrians to come and work for the pharaohs and make glass for Egyptian use. So again, a lot of proximity between Syria and Egypt. And this resulted in some very beautiful works of early glass, which I'm going to show you right now. And you can see that this is now about 5,000 years later after the naturally occurring glass was traded throughout the region. So it gives you a sense of sort of the timeline and pace of innovation. This is actually quite a tiny little object. So one thing we'll be talking about in the coming weeks is checking out the dimensions because it's very hard from looking at a picture like this to know sorry, I think I just did something weird there. Let me see if I can get that to spread out a little bit. Hang on. Okay, it's a little better. Okay, so in any case, this is a very tiny little vessel, and the Egyptians were makeup fanatics, so they used these to hold various makeup like mascara and things on their and eyeliner on their vanity tables. So you can see some beautiful Egyptian glass that was most likely made by Syrian producers in Egypt. To take this history just a little bit farther into the ancient world, the Romans made glass, and here you can see an example of two Roman glass vessels. These are from around the 1st century of the Common Era. So these are now about 1,500 years after the previous example, and again, about 2,000 years before now. We'll talk a little bit about dating too, because dating becomes fairly important in talking about art. So some of these things that I'm talking about right now in passing, we will go back and get a firmer grasp on as we go forward. Okay, jumping forward a little bit in time, another great example of the use of glass now architecturally in cathedral windows in France. And of course, people are still making glass today. They're making it for all kinds of practical uses. If you're in your apartment or dorm room right now, you probably have some glass around you, and the plate glass that's probably in your window panes is a direct descendant of these early glass technologies. We also make glass that is just meant to be enjoyed. It is not particularly meant to be functional. It is sort of more in the line of something that we might think of as art because it belongs to the domain of things that are just for enjoyment or for beauty. So Dale Chihuly is a good example of an American artist who works only in glass. This is a recent installation of his glass work at a museum in Japan that is devoted solely to art glass. And you can see these are not meant to be used as plates or platters, right? They're meant to be on display more in a sculptural type of way. So, so all of that history, right, of glass over this period of time, again, it's possible to track that without really having much of a grip on what we would think of as sort of the chemical composition, for example, of glass or physical properties. And I would say that the same is true of art, even if we cannot define any kind of essence or absolute that will mark something as art or non-art. We actually have no problem studying its history and understanding how it's changed over time. There is a lot we can get without a definition. Nonetheless, many people do still want to define it. I would say most prominently philosophers. There's a branch of philosophy called aesthetics, which deals specifically with questions like this. And they make enormous attempts to try to pin down a definition. And I think even if we don't end up with a firm conclusion in this class, which I'm guessing we probably will not, it's still actually a great idea to sort of entertain other people's definitions. This can just be a way of getting to know this subject a little bit better. So I would caution you that I don't think any one of these definitions is going to end up being the absolute truth. There will not be a question on the final exam that says what is art, and there is a correct answer that you're supposed to select. But despite that lack of firmness or solidity, I actually think that there is value to looking at how people have tried to define it in different places at different times. And particularly, it is probably worth acknowledging, even just right here in the introduction, that this problem has gotten more acute with modern and contemporary art. Because for many viewers, when they look at something that is a modern art piece or is made today, they have the question, well, why is that art at all? Right? And you can see that definition, that means they're presuming a definition, right, of what art should be, what it is, and what it should be, that modern art wouldn't fit it. So I want to take just a second to talk about that, and then I'm going to go ahead and set up our reading assignment and homework assignment. Okay, so this work that you're seeing on the screen would be considered a very key piece of modern art. And this work, which some of you may already know, was made by a French artist who had left France He had gotten his paintings sort of rejected and kicked out of a number of art shows in France, and he thought that because the US was a younger and more forward-thinking country, he might do better here. And so he emigrated to New York. For this particular piece, it was a submission to an art show. And the rules of submission for the art show were any artist who fills out this form and pays $6 can enter the show. Those were the terms. This was an exhibition that was held in 1917. So Marcel Duchamp made this piece, and I'll tell you a little bit more about the piece in a second. He submitted it with the form and the $6. He did not put his own name on it because he didn't want people either to think, well, of course, if Duchamp made it, we know he's an artist and therefore we should accept it. He didn't want it to become personal. He wanted to see what the committee for the show would do if it was just an anonymous entry. So he had a friend deliver it, and you can see he's signed it with a fake name. He's signed his little sculpture here, R. Mutt, which is there's been a lot of work done on this name. I won't go into all of it here, but it's sort of a joke, this name. And he's dated the work, as artists traditionally do with their work. So it's got a signature and a date. That makes it seem art-like. And it has a very simple form and color. It does sort of look like a sculpture. But what it really is a urinal that's kind of flipped the wrong way. So typically this urinal would be hanging on the wall, right? The plumbing connects here, and you would pee into this part of it. Okay, so it's been sort of flipped into a position where it's no longer usable. It's obviously not connected to any plumbing, but it would be very clear to most people looking at it that it actually was. It's not exactly a toilet, but it's sort of related to a toilet, right? So it's obviously, in terms of that part of it, pretty controversial. It's controversial for what it is, but it's also controversial because he didn't make it. He bought this from a maker of urinals and toilets, and they were called the Mott Ironworks. So part of what the name is kind of a corruption of M-O-T-T, but of course this is M-U-T-T, like a Mutt from the Pound, but also like Mutt and Jeff was a popular cartoon at that time. So many people think it has sort of a comic reference in it. Okay, so this sculpture, you can see it's controversial on several levels. And just to kind of bring in the art term here, this would be known as a ready-made, meaning something that I don't have to make. I don't actually have to lift a finger, right, other than to sign it. All I do is purchase it and I sort of recontextualize it. That is my artistic action. Okay? And whenever you see these little gray boxes in here, this is stuff that you can go click on and learn more about the definition of this particular term. So when the National Gallery in Washington did an exhibition on Dada a couple of years ago, they built a very nice website about the Dada movement, and you can link into part of it here, but then you'll see all of it there. Okay, so continuing for a moment with this piece, let me say one other thing. Duchamp didn't call this urinal, he called it fountain. Okay, so he gave it sort of a fancier name than what it actually is. So his artistic production here is limited to renaming it, replacing it, right? Because he places it in a non-functional direction, adding the signature and date, and entering it into the art show. Okay, well, not too surprisingly, and you probably have already guessed this, but not too surprisingly, Duchamp's entry under the false name was rejected. Okay, so the committee said this is not a work of art. We will not include this in the show, even though their stated policy was that anyone who submitted the entry fee and the form would be in. No jury was the idea. Okay, so Duchamp proved that there was a limit to how elastic the definition of art could be. This object was past the definition for the people hanging the show in 1917. Okay? So part of why this has become so important as a work of modern art is that it sets up sort of a new standard, right? Which is art becomes an object that is maybe not made by a skilled person, maybe it's not beautiful, maybe it doesn't have significant subject matter. All of those things that might show up in a prior definition are not in this object. What is in this object? Its capacity to reveal the rules and limits of the art system, right? So it starts, this object starts to reach far beyond itself and begin to point at who makes the rules, who defines art, who decides, who enforces those rules, why does it need rules, right? All of these, so it begins to open up the idea that art is actually posing difficult questions rather than, let's say, involving skill or self-expression, for example. Okay, so just briefly, we actually know this work primarily from photographs. Although this work was indeed fabricated in 1917 and rejected by the committee at the Armory Show, it eventually got thrown out in the trash, probably not surprisingly, right? Because no one really knew that it was art. So we actually now have many copies of these that Duchamp made in 1964 that are in art museums. But it's important to realize that those are not the original, quote-unquote, urinal, even though the original urinal, of course, was not something that Duchamp himself made. But we do know it from this photograph. So Duchamp actually asked a friend of his what he did want to do after the work was rejected was he wanted to make sure everyone knew about the work. So he turned to the press and he turned to an avant-garde magazine called The Blind Man. And he submitted an article about this work as well as this photograph showing the work. And that was actually the only way that people really knew about this piece because remember, it wasn't ever in the show. It was rejected from the show. So you can see here that that Duchamp's friend Stieglitz, who was a very famous photographer in his own right, made this work when Duchamp asked him to, and here you can see he does a couple things to try to make it look more art-like, right? He puts a painted backdrop behind it, right? So we sort of imagine that, and you can see he puts the work actually up on a pedestal like a sculpture would be displayed in an art exhibition. So it looks like a work of sculpture up against other artworks as it would be seen in an exhibition. But again, keep in mind that's a fiction because that didn't really ever actually happen. So this work actually has an enormously complicated history, and this photograph is actually from the 1960s. Duchamp is much older. You see him here having a smoke in front of the work. And it gives you actually a little more sense of like the urinal. So here's the top of it with the plumbing, right? And then the part that's actually the basin that you would pee into. For women, this is less familiar, but for the guys, right, you probably will recognize that shape of the urinal. This photograph is actually from the 1960s, though, when interest in this piece really reemerged, and that's actually when Duchamp started remaking these urinals. So you can read a lot more about this. The Tate Gallery in London owns one of these remakes, and they have a very funny and detailed history available at this link. So go ahead and check that out. All right, so when works like that arrive on the scene, and there are other ready-mades, and artists today still work with ready-mades, in other words, with objects that they are simply recontextualizing. They're simply taking them from somewhere else and putting them into an art space and asking us to think about how they are different or similar when they're in that space. That becomes a very common strategy in contemporary art. And it's one of those things that leads people to sort of question that definition, right? And to sort of say, well, we have to have some kind of definition or theory, right? It can't just be anything. So I want to end with another example that hopefully, as you think through this, will help you sort of flesh out your intuitions about what art is or isn't. And if you want to go ahead and jot down a couple ideas about what you think art is, right, or what it should be, I think that would actually be very helpful, and particularly if you do it now before you do the reading, so that you can just kind of see where which theories you line up with more. It might be helpful as you start to approach it in a more systematic way by studying the different theories, to just sort of think about what your starting point is, what your initial thoughts are about how you would define art. Okay, so we'll just walk through one more example here, and then we'll be done. All right, so is this Coke bottle art? Okay, well, one response that I often get when I do this question live with students is, oh yeah, it totally is. It's a great example of packaging design. It's a really iconic example of 20th century packaging, and you could imagine it, having pride of place as an example of design art. Okay, so that is a completely valid response. It's not really the question I'm asking here. I'm asking if, and maybe the Coke can would be a better choice, right? If you go into your local convenience store and buy yourself a soda, is that art? Okay, so for most people, they would say no, right? They would say, no, that's not art, that's soda. Okay, so then the question becomes, what is really so different about a painting of a Coca-Cola bottle, right? And if you take the example of this particular painting, and I'll show it to you here in an art museum, and you can see it's got some people posing in front of it, so it gives you a sense of the scale of the picture. So if the Coke bottle itself is not art, why would the painting be art? Okay, and the answer for most people would be, well, it's a painting, right? So it involves some transformation, no matter how ordinary or everyday the object is. In order to make a painting, you have to do some work and invest some effort, and it's that addition of the artist's labor that makes this the work of art, right? And then it becomes sort of an odd question, because this particular work, like many of Andy Warhol's works, has sort of phenomenally appreciated in value as measured by the art markets. So a similar painting recently, not that long ago, sold for more than $58 million when you add in That looks a little bit strange, but it's because of the hammer price. Anyway, I'll fix that. It's sold for a lot of money. Let's call that there's a premium in auction houses, so the caption is referring to the price plus the premium. In any case, the that seems crazy, right? Because let's say you can buy this Coke bottle or like a regular can of soda. I don't actually know what the price of that is. I'm going to guess 99 cents, $1.50. Let's say you buy something similar in the convenience store. So why would the painting of that common object appreciate by such a crazy amount, right? How can it possibly be worth that much is certainly one of the questions that will come up, especially when its subject matter is so ordinary. And certainly if you look at this canvas, you can say that it doesn't particularly seem terribly transformed. In other words, Warhol tries to stay very close to the look of the bottle. He does not add a lot. He doesn't even add color. And he also does not add any sense of his attitude or expression or feeling about this, right? It is a very deadpan, kind of straightforward painting that seems conspicuously absent, right? So of any emotional expression, right? So just imagine for a minute that there were big pink splashes on it, right? Or red splashes or yellow, right? Or there was a political message on it, right? Any of those things might change this work quite a bit, but this work is actually very deliberately kind of deadpan and restrained. So those are all things we'll talk about more, but this, for most people, they would be comfortable with saying that the Coca-Cola painting is in fact art, even if they don't think the Coke bottle is. All right, so now let's take another example, and this is from slightly later than the Warhol painting. If you look at these two and say which one is art, well, essentially they look identical. So why is it that the one on the left is just a Coke bottle and the one on the right is an art piece? Okay, so this work on the right is by an artist named Cildo Meirelles, and it actually is quite an interesting piece, which you can read more about at that link. But let me just say briefly that this is taken from the fact that bottles like this, really nice heavyweight glass bottles, used to be refillable. So you would actually save your own bottles, you would return them to the store for a deposit, and the company picks them up, cleans them, and refills them. So they go back, it's the same bottles going back out in circulation. So it's not exactly like recycling, it's more intense than that. It's really refilling. So there's a limited stock of bottles. Obviously bottles are added as they break, but the idea is that these keep going into circulation. So what Meirelles did was he had all these empties, right? And he wrote messages on them. So etched into the glass, and you can't see it here because it's in the part that's unfilled. But he would write little messages, and they weren't at all visible when they were empty, but then when the company would clean them and refill them, you would be able to see them. So this was actually a way of him sending out sort of these funny and subversive little messages via the Coke bottle. Okay, so the Coke bottle never makes it into a museum, right? It never gets a frame around it. It never gets up on a pedestal the way you see the fountain being displayed in Stieglitz's picture, right? It's actually out in the world circulating. And this is a pretty good example of the way contemporary artists think, which is that they actually want their messages. Do I not? Hold on. Somehow I've managed to not really put in the one. Oh, yeah, you can actually see it like right here. It's hard to see. It's just very small. It says Yankees go home, right? So partly it's sort of a protest against having this very powerful U.S. Corporation in Mireles' country. He makes the Coke bottle itself the vehicle for that message. So you can read more about this and see more examples of his Coke bottles at this link. So clearly, right, this is very art-like in terms of critical questioning voice, but it's not at all art-like in terms of artist skill or artist expression, a self-expression of an emotional state. It is not particularly about beauty, right? So it belongs sort of to a different theory of art. Okay, so let me try to briefly wrap this up, and I apologize. This is not as short as I thought it was going to be. But these are some possible theories of art, and there are more, but these are some of the very big ones that people come back to again and again. Okay, so you'll notice that the last two that have the little stars are actually the ones that Harrison really walks us through these theories in the reading from pages 30 to 45, which you will find on Compass in the Week 1 folder. Okay, so the first theory is that art is representational. It's supposed to look like something that we recognize. It represents what our world looks like, some aspect of our world, right? So Andy Warhol's Coca-Cola 3 from 1962 would fit that theory, right? It is a representation of something we recognize. It looks like it. Now, it doesn't look exactly like it, right? But it looks like it enough that we know what it is. So that would be an example of a mimetic theory of art. So it mimics something. It looks like something else. Okay, Mireles, by contrast, this would not fit well in a mimetic definition of art because it doesn't mimic a Coca-Cola bottle. It is not a fake Coca-Cola bottle. It is an actual, real, circulating, used Coca-Cola bottle with a little bit of an addition, right? So it doesn't fit into the idea of representing something in your art. It is not a simulated Coca-Cola bottle because the Coke inside is real, right? And you can really drink it. Okay, another common theory that often comes up is the idea that art is or should be an expression of an emotion, and there is a little bit of ambiguity. Does the emotion belong to the artist, or does the emotion belong to the viewer? In other words, let's say that you happen to see a work of art that really moved you, and it actually touched you so deeply that you cried. Okay? There's kind of a question there, right? That would seem to fit the expressive theory well, because you would say, well, this art led me to have this strong emotional response. Now let's imagine the artist making that. Is the artist in that state while they're making the work? Are they painting and crying, right? Probably not, right? Because you can't really make art while you're crying or while you're furious, right? Or while you're in sexual ecstasy. You can't do that, but you might be able to be in a calm state and create a work that might create that for the viewer, right? So that's one question about an expressive theory, is whose emotion is it? Is it the artist or the viewer? And at what point in time is the person experiencing that emotion? So that's just two kind of brief discussions of mimetic theory and expressive theory. We're going to go into the other two much more when we talk, but just to say, the formalist theory basically says that art, what matters most about art is how it strikes your eye. And it's not necessarily that it has to be beautiful, because there's some very great art that's actually quite ugly, but it has to be sort of strong, bold, memorable, significant form. Okay, so not necessarily like gorgeous and it doesn't have to make you happy or feel relaxed or serene. It has to be a strong visual statement. We're going to talk more about that and about what that means. And then the final one is an institutional theory. And you can see that this one would fit Duchamp's fountain pretty well. It would also fit Cildo Moreles's Coke bottle pretty well, because it says that art is primarily a matter of powerful institutions defining what is and isn't art. So in the case of the fountain, it would be the jury that didn't want to judge, but then ended up rejecting Duchamp's pieces. So art would be defined by institutions like museums, like galleries, like college classes like this one, which will bother with some objects and ignore others. Okay, and so it's really all about someone like a curator or a scholar or an art critic or an influential art dealer conferring value on you and saying, yeah, this is the real thing.